As a player of any skill range, there's never been a better time to dip your feet into fighting games. Within the span of just a couple of months, we got 4 sequels to titles that many people love and that many more people are familiar with, just by being exposed to the games and by word of mouth. Accessibility is also on the rise, leaving behind some of the more archaic features of fighting games in exchange for getting more people to give these games a fair chance. The presence and accessibility of fighting games at the current moment is a beautiful thing. I'm sure you've already seen numerous videos on this topic pop up on your feed already, like Polygon's How to Get Started with Fighting Games, or Alex Nostalgic's Don't Give Up on Fighting Games. I've seen them both, as well as countless others, and they're some of the most helpful resources out there for the aspiring beginner. Those videos are specifically designed to create a support network for beginners looking for some guidance, or for people who just need a little bit of a push to finally make that leap. But that's not what I want to discuss today. Rather than trying to sell you on why you should give fighting games a try, which many YouTubers have already done and have done successfully, I just really want to talk about why I love fighting games and why I find them so appealing. Maybe, just maybe, some of the reasons why I love fighting games can become your reasons for loving them too. To better understand why I love fighting games so much, it's important to dial it back a notch and understand what makes a fighting game a fighting game. How is the genre defined? If you go to Google and search what is a fighting game, you'll get a quick little paragraph from obviously the most credible source that ever exists, our good old pal Wikipedia. And this little paragraph here highlights 2 essential components: character versus character combat, and the mechanics that comprise a fighting game. I want to start with that second point and work my way backwards. Mechanically, most fighting games share the same framework. It's one player versus the other, head-to-head action. Whoever fulfills the conditions for knocking out the opponent first will be crowned the victor. In most games, this is done by depleting the health bar of the opponent before they can deplete yours, or by running out the clock with a life lead. Though if you do camp like that, I question your ethics, and the moment I catch you, I'm gonna hit you with a quick little... Anyway, in some other games, such as Smash Brothers, there is no health bar, but instead a percentage that accumulates each time you get hit. The higher the percentage, the higher the knockback you receive. And the higher the knockback you receive, the more likely it becomes that you'll get knocked off the stage into the blast zone. Discovering clever new ways to crack open your opponent's defenses to deplete their health bar down to 0, or with the case of Smash Brothers, accumulate their percentage to send them flying, is the infinite fighting game loop. The end objective, to make that health bar vanish or to obliterate your opponent from the screen, is a constant variable shared amongst every fighting game. But the way you actually reach that objective is where stuff starts to get a little bit spicy. This is where we start to dive into the system mechanics, which changes from game to game. Take Guilty Gear for example. In the latest entry Strive, you have a tension bar which becomes filled up the more offensive you are, and once full, you can perform things like Roman cancels, which allow you to extend a combo or escape one, as well as the many other applications of the system. Tension can also be spent on these super stylish overdrive moves. Some are invincible and will get you out of a bind, while some are situational and grant buffs to your character. These system mechanics are owed to Daisuke Ishiwatari, the creator of Guilty Gear, and his overall hyper-aggressive vision for the game. In fact, Daisuke thought that fighting games were too easy, which is a real quote by the way, leading him to release the first Guilty Gear in 1998. But the Daisuke rabbit hole goes even deeper than that. Daisuke wrote the original story, designed the main characters, voiced the character's sole bad guy all the way up until 2007, and composed the soundtrack for the game. If you've ever been around the Guilty Gear community, you'll see people talking about Daisuke's vision, which apparently included a love-crazed rock idol who screams on your corpse after defeating you. Guilty Gear is only one example of specialized system mechanics. More recently, Granblue Fantasy vs. Rising introduced the Bravery Point system. Each character gets 3 diamonds above their health bar, which can be spent on moves known as Raging Strikes and Brave Counters. Each consume 1 diamond and have different applications. A Raging Strike can be used as a combo extender, and if you've got some additional meter, it can even be linked to a Raging Chain, which chains your combo further. On defense, you can spend a diamond on a Brave Counter, a technique known as guard cancelling, which basically gets the opponent off of you for a very brief moment. With 3 diamonds, you take normal damage, but the more diamonds you spend, the more damage you'll take, indicated by the portrait of the character flashing red. You can refund diamonds and steal them from the opponent as well by hitting them with moves called Skybound Arts and Super Skybound Arts, the latter only being performable at low enough health, making it an incredibly potent reversal tool. In Smash Bros. On the other hand, you've got a platform and stocks. Fall off the platform or get knocked towards the side, nuked to the ceiling, or dunked to the depths, and you'll lose a stock. Whoever takes all stocks first is the winner. I could keep going on and on, explaining the system mechanics of the many fighting games that I love to play and equally love to watch people play at the professional level. It's one thing to understand the mechanics and another thing entirely to execute them. I'll always be impressed by competitors who can take to the stage and still perform with flawless execution. Well, with all that being said and done, I think it's time we return to our old friend Wikipedia and address that first point, character versus character combat. Most of the time, fighting games involve piloting only one character, but in some games, players pilot multiple. One of the more famous examples that comes to mind is Marvel vs. Capcom 3, where each player selects 3 characters. I mean, it's right there in the name. Capcom knew exactly what they were doing with this game, and it definitely shows. Years after its release, it's still just as popular as ever, making the rounds at EVO for many years, though the history and impact of MVC3 is a story for another time.
Double turn! Hold up! The king! I'm not even gonna knock it yet. I'm not even gonna. Oh my god! Just down it! Takes it! He takes it! He's back! It! Unbelievable! He's back!
At the end of the day, the number of characters a player controls can also be considered its own system mechanic, but the important thing I want to highlight here is not the characters on the screen, but the players behind these characters. This is what makes fighting games a genre and a league of its own. It's you against one other person, your game plan versus theirs, your skills up against their own. Most other esports titles revolve around a team with shared responsibility. If you lose as a team, and if you win, it was also by the efforts of that same team. Sure, some players may stand out as the MVPs, and others might be throwing very hard, but regardless, these games involve isolated incidents that culminate into a collective victory or a collective loss. The same just cannot be said for fighting games. Though it might be a bitter pill to swallow, if you lose, and of course barring any technical difficulties, then there's no one to blame but yourself. Your game plan might have been foiled and might have been figured out by your opponents. They might have been more skillful than you. It happens. Even while moving on to the next opponent, you sit on that loss and mull it over, thinking about what you could have done differently. It's an incredibly humbling experience that makes you crave to improve, to put in the work and dedication to prove that you could have done better. And believe me, you will always do better, so long as you stay consistent with that dream. I want to close this section out with a term that we use often in the Smash Bros. Community that's also begun to take root in other fighting games as well. This term is known as no Johns. The story goes that one day, a player named John would always make excuses for why he lost. John's friend, a player named Zulu, began to use the term no Johns to indicate that the reason why John lost was pretty straightforward. His opponent was just better than him. The term became so popular to the point that Reggie Fils-Aimé, the now retired president of Nintendo of America, used the term in his EVO 2014 speech.
You never know. I might show up to challenge you someday. And if we ever do get to go head to head, please, no Johns. Good luck out there, and may the best Smasher win.
The concept of fighting games as a genre is a broad spectrum. Even though they all share the same gameplay loop, it's not enough to say that a fighting game is a fighting game, since they vary drastically in how they approach the fighting game formula. This creates a plethora of subgenres within the larger category of fighting games. But just like with driving a car, once you get to know one subgenre, it becomes easy to transfer that knowledge to other subgenres. Everyone's gonna have their preferences, and fighting games are no exception. There are just too many subgenres to cover all at once, but the largest categories that people resonate with the most are street likes, tag team fighters, anime fighters, platform fighters, and arena fighters. Starting with the most recognizable subgenre, street likes, also known as streets, are fighting games with designs reminiscent of Street Fighter 2. Why not Street Fighter 1? Well, it's because the game looked like this.
Look, I try. Why can't I even block, bro?
You can't block the fireball.
There's no blocking.
Street Fighter 2, on the other hand, refined the gameplay to perfection, creating what many refer to as the golden standard for modern fighting games. Capcom knew they'd struck a winning formula too, since Street Fighter 2 got re-released like a bajillion times on every single platform known to mankind. As the namesake of this genre, Street Fighter is the game many people think of when they think of fighting games. Mechanically, it paved the way for systems that are in place today in various different fighting games, like button inputs, movement and blocking tech, super moves, invincibility frames, and so much more. Culturally, it arguably had the biggest impact on the community itself, and those who viewed the community from the outside. I mean, who could ever forget Justin Wong vs Daigo in Street Fighter 3 at EVO 2004? That iconic moment occurred all the way back in 2004, 20 years ago now if you can believe it. It's now 2024 and we're on the 6th iteration of mainline Street Fighter with the release of Street Fighter 6 just last year. The key franchise that helped define the genre that it essentially invented is going incredibly strong. So you can only imagine how much stronger of a hold that all fighting games collectively have on people in recent years. Street Fighter was the biggest kid on the block, but there were still other titles that helped mold this specific subgenre. SNK put out Fatal Fury after Capcom's success with Street Fighter, then released King of Fighters 2 years after Street Fighter 2 had already hit the market. The crazy part is that Takashi Nishiyama, accredited as the founder of Street Fighter, left Capcom after the first game and joined SNK to create Fatal Fury and subsequently King of Fighters. You know that blonde character with a hat that goes... Yeah, that's Terry Bogard, the main character of Fatal Fury and King of Fighters. Ryu is the main character for Street Fighter, with Ken being somewhat of a deuteragonist and side character. All three of these characters originated from the games that Nishiyama directed, and all three of these characters are also in Smash Brothers, so I mean, you tell me if this guy didn't essentially create what are the founding fathers of modern fighting games. On top of these three games, there are still plenty more highly recognizable and respected games in the subgenre. Midway Games entered the fighting game race around the same time as the release of Street Fighter 2 with their own unique fighting game, Mortal Kombat. The two aspects of Mortal Kombat that sets it apart from the other Street-like games is the insane levels of violence, which hadn't been seen before in a video game up until that point, and also the fact that the game originated in the United States and not in Japan. Many people are quick to latch onto the discussion of violence in video games that Mortal Kombat paved the way for, which was definitely a revolutionary movement, don't get me wrong, but a small fact that people tend to gloss over is that this movement gained the traction that it did because the game itself was very fun and had solid fundamentals. What I mean to say is that the appeal that fighting games had to a worldwide audience, even all the way back in the 90s, was apparent from the onset. After Street Likes, the next subgenre on the list are tag team fighters. The reason why I organized it the way I did is because tag team fighters are still very fundamentally similar to the Street-like games I mentioned just a few moments ago, with the key difference being that it's not just two characters on screen anymore. The whole motto of tag team fighters is, you see those characters on the roster right there? You like to play them, right? Well, how about you play multiple at once? Players pick characters up to the limit of however many the game allows for, then tags between the characters in the middle of the match. Depending on the game, the tagging has different properties, and some, if not most of the time, the characters currently not on screen can be called in as an assist. Marvel vs. Capcom is one of the more famous examples of a timeless tag team fighter. You've got the massive Marvel comic cast, as well as the Capcom gaming library fused into one game, allowing for an insane amount of possible combinations. Dragon Ball FighterZ is also another extremely popular 3v3 tag team fighter, drawing from the expansive history of the Dragon Ball series, where out of 43 characters, almost a fourth of them are some kind of variation of Goku. BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle is another popular tag team fighter with a 2v2 system. The game draws from a multitude of other franchises to comprise its roster. You've got the original BlazBlue cast, the majority of the characters from Persona 4 Arena, Under Night in Birth, and the Western anime series RWBY. The roster got even bigger with other franchises coming into the fray after the game's launch as DLC, with characters from the fighting games Arcana Heart and Akatsuki Blitzcomp joining the roster, as well as some characters from the questionable gaming franchise Senran Kagura.
Alright, so now...
Did he just nut?
But without getting too sidetracked, tagging characters in and out and calling assists is only a piece of the puzzle, since players also have other unique tools that each tag team fighter brings to the table at their disposal. Marvel vs. Capcom 3's big game changer is the X Factor, a once per match tool that gives an overall boost to attack while also tightening defense, while also being stronger the fewer characters a player has left alive. I'm not all too familiar with Dragon Ball FighterZ, but I did play enough to figure out that one of the game's unique mechanics is essentially I myself don't have much gameplay experience with tag team fighters, but my fondness for the subgenre comes from the players who play competitively. These players have to be aware of the moveset of upwards of 6 characters at a time, while also utilizing the game's unique system mechanics and keeping basic fighting game fundamentals in mind. These players are amongst the most dedicated I've ever seen to their craft. Before I move on to the next category, I want to take a moment to quickly squeeze in and talk about games such as Virtua Fighter, Soul Calibur, and the big man currently making waves, Tekken. The reason why I didn't mention these games in the Street section is because, while they are fundamentally similar, these games set themselves apart by taking full advantage of being 3D. And I don't mean that graphically. While a standard side-scrolling fighting game sits on the X and Y axis, games like Tekken also utilize the Z axis. You can move into the background and the foreground, opening up entirely new layers of gameplay possibilities. The classic combo count that you see in other fighting games isn't as big of a deal in these kinds of fighting games, where instead of poking the opponent's defense and making the most out of a stray hit, you're instead trying to get what's known as a launcher to keep your opponent stunned in the air or on the ground for as long as possible. I played quite a bit of Tekken 7 with my friends back in the day, but it was more of a slugfest than anything else. Just the addition of a circular 3D arena creates a genre that pulls from classic fighting games and expands on it drastically, though it's not to be confused with arena fighters, which are a whole different ballpark that we'll get to later. Up next we have anime fighters, my favorite subgenre of fighting games. Once again, the running theme of being fundamentally similar to Street Fighter is also apparent in the majority of anime fighters, but what sets them apart are the art style and movement. They tend to resemble characters from anime. Some games adapt some sort of Japanese media, like Melty Blood drawing from the visual novel Tsukihime, or Dragon Ball FighterZ just straight up using the Dragon Ball name. Some are original works, like Guilty Gear or Under Night in Birth. These games typically feature very fast-paced movement like air dashing and super jumping, mechanics that aren't normally seen in street-like fighting games. Some even have instant killing moves which usually have strict requirements to activate, but will end the match instantly if pulled off successfully.
Heads up! I'm gonna show you what an idol can do! This is my resolve. Feel it! Time for my full strength! And another one!
I got my fighting game start with Smash 64, a platform fighter, but it wasn't until the anime fighter Persona 4 Arena that I would be introduced to the ever-expanding world of fighting games. Persona 3 Portable is my favorite game of all time, so when I heard the story would be continued in a fighting game, I just knew I had to give it a try. Roughly a year later, the game would get an enhanced sequel called Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, and ever since then, it's remained uncontested as my favorite fighting game. In 2022, the game made an unexpected return with a port to modern consoles, and even though I was over the moon and played the game for an unhealthy amount of hours, the game was just as barren as the original launch way back in 2013. It's not that I minded or anything like that. This is a fighting game made for clinically insane people. It's packed to the roof with mechanics and tools, some of which originate from the Persona series, and some of which come from the likes of Guilty Gear. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is what you get when you take what makes an anime fighter and dial it to 11 with no regards whatsoever for balance. The game was developed by Arc System Works, the guys behind the development of Guilty Gear, Blaze Blue, and Grand Blue Fantasy, as well as the publisher for the French-bred anime fighter titled Under Night in Birth. They're often regarded as the king of anime fighters, and for good reason. They constantly push the genre forward with each new game that they develop, and as of right now, they're going strong into Guilty Gear Strive's 4th season. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is Arc System Works taking off the restraints and just going wild. The game makes you feel like you can do anything and take on anybody, and that's exactly what young me thought, bringing me to where I am today. Prior to getting into anime fighters, like I'd mentioned earlier, I was exclusively a Smash Bros. Guy. It's my most played fighting game by an insane margin, but this was due mostly to the fact that I was a Nintendo kid growing up, and this series was one of the hottest items on store shelves. This is about the best time to transition into the next subgenre, platform fighters. These games involve fighting on a floating platform and emphasize taking aerial control rather than staying planted on the ground. Instead of a health bar, you're focused on instead knocking your opponent off the stage and preventing yourself from being knocked away. With how different the genre operates, a lot of the Street Fighter basics are lost on platform fighters, though being distantly related to the originals doesn't make these titles any less of a fighting game. Ryu, Ken, and Terry are in Smash Ultimate with a lot of their classic movesets, so the fundamentals of fighting games do actually have a place in platform fighters, even if it's not as central to the gameplay. I personally find them to be a very nice change of pace, because on top of trying to string together combos and crack open your opponent's defense, you're now also thinking about how you can keep them off the stage effectively. Arguments have been made in the past as to whether platform fighters can even be considered fighting games, but with just a quick glance at the history of fighting games, at almost every turn there is the presence of a platform fighter, none more so than Smash Brothers. If you go to the official fighting game glossary, which I'll put a link for down below so you guys can also check it out, it's a pretty cool resource. Smash Brothers has its very own category. As a community, we shouldn't be looking for ways to discredit games, but instead work towards accommodating them. And that goes double for arena fighters, the very last subgenre in this lengthy section. The reason I saved this for last is because these games stray the furthest from the Street Fighter standard. Most don't use motion inputs or stick to a side-scrolling 2D screen. Characters exist in a wide 3D arena where they flip around and play cat and mouse. I used to have zero relation to arena fighters until I got a chance to play Naruto Shippuden Ultimate Ninja Storm 4 at my cousin's house. Even with no prior knowledge of Naruto under my belt, I still thoroughly enjoyed myself, and that's where I began to see the appeal to these fighting games. As a result, I started to actively track the development of a series that I did have knowledge of, Demon Slayer, and bought the Arena Fighter adaptation on launch day. Admittedly, I didn't end up playing it much after the first month, but while I was playing it, it was an absolute blast. By the nature of how these games are designed, they're much easier to get into, but still just as difficult to master as any other fighting game. Every single one of these genres I love equally, each for their own reasons. Street-likes demonstrate classic footsies and slow-paced, calculated movements. Watching tag team fighters is like a dopamine injection straight into my brain. And the same goes for watching pros Korean backdash in Tekken while bobbing and weaving in and out of the foreground. Executing the wildest and most stylish combos in anime fighters is where I feel most at home, while dunking my opponent into the blast zone with a meteor smash in Smash Brothers gives me that sensation of being a child again. Arena fighters are my comfort games, allowing me ease of mind to just kick back and not have to worry about execution. It's important to take a moment and ponder which of these genres speaks out to you the most and the reasoning behind that fixation. And if one or more of these genres is completely foreign to you, then hopefully you'll give any one of them a try and find your own reason to lovingly latch onto them, just like I did anime fighters and platform fighters not so long ago.
Yo, wait, what? How did I do that? You did it. I didn't mean to do it.
You did it though. You did it!
Wow. Wow. That's interesting, bro.
How do you feel? How do you feel after doing that?
I mean, that was a good round for me.
That was a hella good round for you. What you just saw was a clip of my close friend executing a Guilty Gear technique known as roaming Roman cancel, then proceeding to win the round against me. Weeks ago when he'd first picked up the game, he would often express how he thought he'd never be able to learn the more advanced mechanics and use them in an actual match. The shock in his voice stemmed from the fact that he pulled off a technique he once thought himself incapable of performing, and not only did he manage to pull it off without a hitch, he also took home the victory. My excited reaction was me realizing that my friend was growing up right before my eyes after putting in the countless hours and the efforts. These moments of growth are at the heart of fighting games. No match is a wasted one. Even if that player is significantly better than you are, there's always valuable information to be learned. Losing is par for the course, and like the majority of us, you'll be basking in victories and sulking in losses in equal helpings. Letting the loss simmer or riding the high of a previous victory as you enter the ring once more to face another challenger is what fighting games are all about. In the modern age, this is achieved more and more through online play. Unlike other games that also utilize an internet connection, fighting games are still relatively new to this frontier, believe it or not. Back in the good old days of Call of Duty and Halo LAN parties, fighting games were basically no different, primarily existing in arcades while also slowly transitioning into home consoles off to the side. When their internet became mainstream and Microsoft began to offer services such as Xbox Live, LAN parties quickly began to fizzle out of the picture, but fighting games still stuck around in their arcade cabinets. They coexisted well with their home console variants, owing mostly to the fact that online play didn't bode too well with fighting games where inputs need to be precise and frame perfect. Even the smallest amount of lag or delay could throw a player completely off their game. That's when rollback netcode began to enter the picture, a genius system that makes playing a fighting game online feel like the player is genuinely right beside you in the same room. Fighting games were slow on the uptake, but nowadays it's become so common that any fighting game launching without rollback netcode is a surefire way to kill a player base. Turning on the game, launching it, and going straight into matchmaking to compete against complete strangers that could be on the other side of the globe is what makes the online experience so special. One moment you could be fighting against a player who zones you out from afar and makes it a total pain to get close enough to engage them. Then the next moment you could go against a hyper-aggressive player who leaves you no room to breathe. Getting into these online sessions and cracking open your opponent's game plan, almost as if you're in their own head, is the addictive property that keeps these games alive for years and years on end. Most games even have a way of tracking your relative skill level with a ranking system. Guilty Gear has a thing called the Tower, where each floor is its own skill level. You can't fight players at a lower level than you, but you're free to challenge players on floors at or above the one that you're currently on. There are 10 floors with a secret 11th floor called Celestial that only the best players can get into. The system isn't perfect, and it definitely comes with its own set of frustrations, like not being able to tell if you're in the upper end or lower half of the floor in terms of skill until you're literally one match away from ranking up or deranking. But having the ability to play with people at your same skill level or challenge those above you in a lackless environment is a perfect way to grow and improve. Granblue Fantasy vs Rising features a progression bar in its competitive matchmaking system, giving you a rough estimate of whether or not you're climbing rapidly through the ranks or if your growth has stalled. The cool thing about this progression system is that any rank below S, you cannot derank to another letter. So once you've hit a new letter, the only way to go is upwards. Win streaks also grant double the progression, so it's a very encouraging way of getting players to consistently play online by removing the fear of regressing, at least until you hit the upper ranks. The game also features a casual matchmaking system where none of this matters and you can be put up against a person of any skill range. Random matchmaking as well as consistent game balancing updates and brand new characters are what keep fighting games afloat in the modern era. In-person events like tournaments have begun to embrace the online environment, allowing players to compete from literally anywhere in the world that has an internet connection. That's not to say that fighting games should go fully online, since the community thrives most when they're in the same room together, but being able to practice at home and then transfer your skills to an in-person match is the main resource that the majority of players will be relying on. The online experience is most fun for me when I'm playing with friends. Getting into a call and just talking to talk, trying out new characters or gameplay mechanics without worrying about embarrassing ourselves. It's a completely different vibe than online matchmaking, where I'm hyper fixated on beating my opponent and climbing up the ranks. With friends, winning or losing is an afterthought. Enjoying ourselves in the moment and learning together is what matters most. I touched on it briefly already, but playing fighting games in a venue or at your friend's house on the same screen can be considered as part of the offline experience, and it's probably what most people think of when you associate the words offline and fighting games. Primarily, that's what should come to mind when you imagine fighting games offline. I watch these tournaments and events all the time, and one day, I'd wish to fly out to EVO and be a competitor myself or join an online tournament. This is the essence of what it means to play fighting games offline. But to me, the term has a dual meaning that encompasses so much more. When I first started out playing fighting games, I would get insanely nervous when I went online to play against random people. Of course, over time, this got better the more games I played and the more I realized that it really isn't that big of a deal to lose. There's no better way to deal with nerves than to actually do the thing that you're nervous about. But before I'd become aware of this approach, I'd very occasionally go online and stick mostly to playing my fighting games offline, but not in the sense that I'd go out to physically play with other people. What I mean by offline in this sense is single player, and this is where that dual meaning to offline play comes into the picture. Though it's not talked about too often, most fighting games have single player content, and personally, whether or not I play a fighting game depends a lot on what there is to do on my own without the need for another player. It was the promise that Persona 4 Arena would continue the story of Persona 3 that got me into the game in the first place, and that story mode is what eventually got me into the fighting game rabbit hole. In fact, while we're on the subject, there's no better fighting game that I've played up until this point that does single player content better than Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. It might even do it a little too well, causing the online to suffer a bit. One drawback was that the 2020 port to modern consoles didn't launch with rollback netcode, and if you remember what I said earlier, that's just an easy way to kill a game, so any hope of drawing new players in was made very difficult. It eventually got patched in months later, but it was a little too late at that point. Regardless of these online setbacks, the single player content was preserved perfectly. Some modes come standard in fighting games, such as an arcade mode, mission or combo trial mode, tutorial mode, and a training mode. Not only does Persona 4 Arena Ultimax feature all of these modes, it also features two other modes, Story Mode and Golden Arena Mode. Story mode speaks for itself and is a mix between the visual novel style that the Persona series is known for and the anime fighting combat that Arc System Works specializes in. The story is conveniently split between the Persona 3 section and the Persona 4 section, alongside a couple of branching choices for those who want to go for the 100%, making it a pretty solid mode to replay. However, my favorite mode to come out of any fighting game is undoubtedly the Golden Arena mode in Persona 4 Arena Ultimax. This mode turns the game into a hybrid between a fighting game and an RPG, owing to the Persona series' roots and Arc System Works' masterful handling of the fighting game design. You progress through different routes, leveling up and learning new skills along the way, facing stronger and stronger AI-controlled enemies. Each character has their own level and skills, and on top of that, you can pair them with a navigator that also grants unique buffs, making the replay value off the charts. I don't know if I have Atlas or Arc System Works to thank for this mode, so I'll just thank both of them equally, though Arc System Works definitely saw the appeal of the Golden Arena and implemented the mode in their next game, BlazBlue's Central Fiction. In that game, you have what's known as the Abyss, which is similar to the Golden Arena mode with custom character stats and skills. BlazBlue's Central Fiction also has 3 arcade modes for each character, and that's a total of 36 characters, so 108 different possible arcade routes to experience. There's already a boatload of single-player content for a game that originally came out in 2015, but even in 2022, the game received rollback netcode, adding to its value exponentially. Going back to Persona 4 Arena though, there's still more to be talked about since it doesn't end at just the story and Golden Arena modes. Persona 4 Arena Ultimax doesn't skimp out on the standard modes that you'd find in other fighting games. The challenge mode, this game's version of combo trials, gets progressively more difficult but that much more satisfying when you finally manage to pull off a combo. If you ever get stuck, you can always view a sample recording and go at it again. The ending to these challenges is probably the best part and incredibly hilarious because the game just straight up says, "Figure it out yourself, champ," and doesn't even offer you a demo to view.
The first one was hard. Bro, what? What does that mean? I don't even know what this means.
The arcade mode is structured like your average arcade mode, with stages that end in one of 2 bosses. But a cool little feature of the arcade mode in Persona 4 Arena Ultimax is that it's a compressed version of the story mode. As long as you aren't playing a character that was introduced later as DLC in the Ultimax sequel, then you'll basically get a quick version of the story mode with voice acting and unique character interactions. I also want to give praise to Granblue Fantasy vs Rising for its single player content, and while I'm at it, I might as well talk about its unique online content too. The RPG aspect of Golden Arena mode are actually bundled into the story mode of Granblue, so not only are you progressing through the story, you're also building your character along the way. The other standard single-player modes are also present here, but Granblue excels more at appealing to an online audience with a free version that anybody can play right now. The drawback is that you don't get to choose which character you play since they're on a rotation weekly, but you still get to play against others who own the full game. The game also has a mode called Grand Brews, which is literally just Fall Guys in a fighting game. I know that these are online features, but I think that they're geared specifically towards people like my past self who showed interest in fighting games but weren't quite ready to make that leap into the online realm. Years ago, when rollback netcodes started to become more widespread until it would eventually become the standard, I was pretty worried that fighting games would slowly start to leave behind single player content and focus solely on online play. Thankfully, I'm happy to say that I was proved wrong. Tekken 8 launched with a bunch of single player content, most of which came standard with fighting games, but a few that are unique to the series, like Tekken Ball and Arcade Quest. I've already mentioned Granblue Fantasy vs Rising, which just released recently, but even before the release of that game and Tekken 8, another game had it all figured out, and it won't shock you to find out that that game in question is Street Fighter 6, a poetic way to return to the root of modern fighting games. The game featured a very lengthy campaign mode, clocking in at about 17 hours for just the main content, and over double that time for all content. You get to customize your own character, watch Luke from Streets praise your customization, then get out there and start tearing the town apart, building your character along the way with legacy moves featured across the franchise. Single player content doesn't get much better than this, and I've got high hopes that other fighting games in the future will follow Street Fighter 6's example. While I was making this video, I realized that the more and more I try to explain why I love fighting games, the more I start to fall in love with them all over again. This video took me quite a while to make, and it was because every time I decided I was going to work on it, I'd get completely enamored by the games I wished to speak about and play them until I had no time to work on the video. I'm not a pro player. My ranks are below average and I tend to have a negative record, so more losses than wins. I'm not an expert either. I'm not all too familiar with frame data or combo routing, though I do know that X move is slow or Y move can be comboed into Z move. This image right here was a recent session for me in Grand Blue Fantasy vs Rising. I didn't win a single match, and of course, it left me a little frustrated with myself. Instead of letting it get to my head, I went offline and played some arcade against nightmare level CPU, which is the highest difficulty, and these CPU tend to press buttons quite a bit. It helped me refine my poking strategy, as well as how to hold my defense and wait for the right moment. And when I got back online, my record was much better, and I even ended up ranking from B5 to B4 with my favorite character, Gran. I may not be a pro or an expert, but I'll tell you what I am, an enthusiast. And that's all you need to be to simply pick up and play a fighting game on your own terms. For some people, that's going online and conquering your opponents, whoever they might be, then taking that competitive spirit to offline events. For others, it's sticking entirely to single player content, going up against CPU and messing with the mechanics in a relaxed environment. Sometimes it's not even about actually playing the fighting game. Some people just love to kick back and watch others play, or to follow the history and the current scene of the fighting game community. The creator of the Tekken series, Katsuhiro Harada, when he's not busy directing any games, he's literally competing in the very same games that he developed, just as a regular competitor. Could you imagine going on stage and realizing that your opponent is the guy that made the game that you're about to compete against him in? Or what about Daisuke's vision, which, need I remind you, involves shenanigans such as this? At the end of the day, this genre is whatever you set out for it to be. And that is the ultimate reason behind why I love fighting games.